Story 1. The frozen figure. It was the coldest winter Michigan had seen in decades. The temperature had plummeted to record-breaking lows, and everything was covered in a thick blanket of snow. For Mia, a young college student, winter break meant returning to her childhood home in a small, quiet town nestled in the woods. The house was cozy and warm, a stark contrast to the icy world outside. But that winter, something about the home felt off. Maya's parents had left for a brief trip to visit her grandparents, leaving her alone in the house for a couple of nights. At first, she didn't mind. She enjoyed the solitude, reading by the fire and sipping hot cocoa. But on the second night, as the wind howled outside, she began to feel uneasy. It started with small, almost unnoticeable things: the feeling of being watched, the faint sound of crunching snow outside her window. She brushed it off as paranoia. Around midnight, Mia decided to head to bed. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears strain for any sound. As she turned off the lights, a sudden noise froze her in place, a faint tapping coming from the large bay window in the living room. Heart pounding, Mia hesitated before walking over to investigate. She pulled the curtain aside, expecting to see a branch swaying in the wind. Instead, her breath caught in her throat. Standing just beyond the glass was a figure. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but the shape was unmistakable. A man, tall and gaunt, stood motionless, staring directly at her. His face was pale, almost blending in with the snow in his eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and filled with something she couldn't quite describe. Fear? Desperation? Malice? Mia stumbled back, her heart racing. She grabbed her phone to call the police, but as she dialed, she dared another glance at the window. The figure was gone. She tried to calm herself, convincing herself it was just her imagination, or perhaps a prank. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The police arrived within 20 minutes, but found no footprints in the snow, no signs of anyone having been there. Probably just a trick of the light, the officer suggested, though his tone didn't sound entirely convinced. They left, and Mia locked every door and window in the house before retreating to her room. That night, sleep eluded her. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind set her on edge. Just as she began to drift off, a loud bang jolted her awake. It came from the back door. Trembling, she grabbed a flashlight and her father's old baseball bat. As she crept downstairs, the banging grew louder, more insistent. She reached the door and shone her flashlight through the small window at the top. There he was again. The man. This time, he was closer, his face pressed against the glass. His eyes were wild, his breath fogging up the window. He pounded on the door with his fists, his muffled voice barely audible over the wind. "Let me in," he pleaded. "Please, it's so cold." Maya's instincts screamed at her to run, but she stood frozen in place. Something about him didn't feel right. His movements were jerky, unnatural. And then she noticed his hands. They were blue, almost black, as if frostbite had claimed them. Despite his pleas, she knew she couldn't let him in. "Go away," she shouted, her voice trembling. The man's expression shifted, his desperation giving way to anger. He slammed his fists against the door harder, cracking the glass. Mia turned and ran, locking herself in her bedroom and calling the police again. This time, they took her seriously. When they arrived, they found the back door shattered, but the man was nowhere to be seen. Only a set of footprints led into the woods, disappearing into the frozen night. The next morning, the police returned with grim news. They had found the man's body in the forest, frozen solid. But the chilling part? According to the coroner, he had been dead for days, long before Mia ever saw him at her window. Story 2. The cabin in the blizzard. Tom and Rachel were an adventurous couple who loved the outdoors. That winter, they decided to rent a remote cabin in the mountains for a week of skiing and relaxation. The cabin was rustic but charming, surrounded by towering pines and endless snow. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and the isolation was part of the appeal. The first few days were idyllic. They skied, built snowmen, and enjoyed cozy evenings by the fire. But on the fourth day, a massive blizzard rolled in, trapping them inside. The wind howled relentlessly, and snow piled up against the windows, blocking out the light. With no cell service and the nearest neighbors miles away, they settled in for what they thought would be a cozy, if slightly inconvenient, night. As the storm raged on, strange things began to happen. It started with faint noises, scratching sounds coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. At first, they assumed it was just the wind or perhaps small animals seeking shelter. But the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, as if something was moving through the cabin. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing from the attic above. Tom and Rachel exchanged nervous glances. "Did the rental agency mention anything about an attic?" Rachel whispered. Tom shook his head. They tried to dismiss it, convincing themselves it was just their imagination playing tricks on them. But when the footsteps continued, Tom decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, he climbed the narrow staircase leading to the attic. The air grew colder with each step, and the beam of the flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The attic was empty, just a dusty, barren space with a single, broken window. Relieved, Tom returned downstairs, but Rachel's expression stopped him in his tracks. "What?" he asked. "Tom," she said, her voice trembling, "while you were up there, I heard footsteps down here." A chill ran down his spine. They decided to barricade the bedroom door and wait out the storm. Sleep was impossible. The sounds continued throughout the night, scratching, footsteps, faint whispers just beyond the door. And then, in the early hours of the morning, everything went silent. When daylight finally broke, the storm had subsided. Eager to leave, Tom and Rachel packed their belongings and opened the front door. But what they saw outside made them freeze in terror. The snow was undisturbed, except for a single set of footprints leading away from the cabin. The prints were large, inhuman, and impossibly deep, as if whatever made them was monstrously heavy. The couple didn't stick around to investigate. They drove straight to the nearest town and reported the incident to the local authorities. The officers seemed skeptical, but agreed to check out the cabin. Days later, Tom received a call from the sheriff. "We didn't find anyone or anything unusual in the cabin," the sheriff said. "But there's something you should know. That cabin? It's been abandoned for years. The rental agency you mentioned doesn't exist." To this day, Tom and Rachel can't explain what happened in that cabin. But every winter, when the snow begins to fall, they can't help but think about those footsteps in the blizzard and the thing that left them behind.